Stuart Holbrook has spent his life in the world of collectors. As president of Therials, the world's leader in the auction of antique dolls and figurative art for over 30 years, he's managed the often personal and always wild world of collecting and collectors. His market expertise and knowledge of trends comes to life in The Curious Collector, where he shares his experience and experiences in real-life stories, alongside sage advice on how to build great collections within the happy life of a collector.
How does a collector value a doll? And this is actually probably the most significant aspect of your collecting life, both during your collecting and at the end of your collecting, of trying to figure out what something is worth. Now, let me start first of all that if you're not a doll collector and listening to this, it really does extend to any collectible. I mean, there are parallels throughout the industry in a number of different hobbies, whether you're collecting comic books or action figures or sports memorabilia. There's going to be some similarities that I think everyone will get something out of this in the basic sense of that age-old question of what is this worth? So it's very complex. And the important thing, I think, to start this off with is understanding that there's a vast difference between buying and selling. And these are the two moments when valuation of a collectible, a doll, in this particular example, will come into play for you, the collector. So buying, obviously, when you're looking to add to your collection and looking to obtain that piece you've always dreamed of to put in your cabinet or cases at home. And then that moment when you might want to sell either that item or the entire collection. And how do you value them in each of those circumstances? Because a very wise, sort of sage friend of mine over the years has always used this quote in relating to my business and in basically saying that in your world, everything is different depending on whether you're buying or selling. And it really is true because they tend to be kind of conflicting emotions, conflicting patterns of how you look at the value of an object. And the obvious being that when a buyer is looking to buy it, they're looking to get it for the best price possible. When a buyer is looking to sell it, they're looking to get the highest price possible. So you've got these two competing aspects working against each other at different moments of your valuation of your dolls and collections. So we're going to kind of break through each of those scenarios and the factors that need to be in place in your understanding how to best value an item in these particular circumstances. So let's start off first of all with buying, because the reality is most people selling a collection, it's a one-time thing. But buying is a lifelong process of one piece after another. And you're faced constantly with that question of, how much do I pay? And many people have even asked me that, Stuart, how much should I pay for this? Well, kind of reminds me of the English professor I had years ago when I asked, how long should that essay be? And he looked at me and he said, as long as a piece of string. Meaning basically that valuing an item is very personal. Mildred Seeley, who was a collector that I really respected, kind of a pioneer in the industry from the 60s on into the 90s, and she always had a lot of really sort of homespun advice for collectors that I think was very poignant and very tested in her experience. So people would ask her the same question. What do you pay? How do you value a doll? And Mildred Seeley would always say to them, you pay whatever it takes if it makes your heart sing. Very simple, right? And it actually is, because ultimately you are the person who has to live with that doll. You're the person who wants that doll. And if it's a holy grail doll, if it's the item you've been searching for 25 years, you've been up at markets, at auctions and shows and antique shops all across the world, dreaming of this one piece, and you finally find it, why would you have any limitation whatsoever? Clearly, it took 25 years. Clearly, it's an incredibly rare piece, and clearly it's something you love. So you can't pay too much for that item. The value is exponential in your particular book of valuations. So I start off first by telling people that the emotions you have for that particular item are at the very core of how much it is worth. But there are a lot of factors that do come into play in this process that collectors are either consciously using, or if you are really experienced, you're doing it almost unconsciously. That is determining what I call the 7 factors of valuation. I don't go through a checklist through all 7 points. They just are sort of naturally ingrained in me. And as collectors are in this for many years, they become naturally ingrained in them as well. And that it's sort of like a calculator running through your head of figuring it all out in the context of your experience on this valuation. So we have a doll and we sit down with this doll and we want to determine how much is it worth. I want to buy this doll. How much should I pay? Well, the first thing that's going to be sort of running through this calculator in your mind are the current market trends and the availability of this particular doll. If it's something that you see quite often, if it's something that's fairly common on the marketplace and the market trend is fairly stable, you tend to kind of use comparables out there that you might find. Now, in the previous podcast, we talked about investing and we talked about the old days of how the blue books and the price guides sort of dictated everything in valuations of what collectors paid for an item. And we talked about how those days have long been over since really the advent of the internet and eBay and a change in how collectors kind of view pieces for themselves. So the old days of those price guides are gone. Where we look now is primarily the internet and watching sort of trends and patterns. Let's take an example of a Cameron Reinhardt 114. Now, this is a model that you used to look in the price guide. It would give you different sizes that they appeared in, and it would tell you a value that this person who authored the price guide believed it was worth. Now, supposedly it was done using data of auction prices, show prices, that type of thing. But I think it was really limited in not understanding each unique doll for its individual merits. And that's where books really fail. But it did give you a guideline. Well, today the internet can give you that. You just need to Google Cameron Reinhardt 114. You can even mine it down to Theriault's auctions, and you're going to get returns of hundreds of KNR 114s that have gone at Theriault's. You might find some that have gone on eBay, other areas that were sold. And you'll be able to kind of piece together a trend. And it's not going to give you, okay, well, now I know it's worth $3,426.86. I mean, markets don't work that way. I wish it were that easy. No, but it's going to give you kind of a framework of where value might be. That is it a doll that's worth typically in the hundreds of dollars? Is it a doll that's typically worth thousands of dollars in the single digits? Or is it something that, oh my gosh, look at this. These dolls have been bringing upwards of $20,000, $30,000, $40,000 and quite regularly. So it will help you kind of find, first of all, what box it fits into in the market. And that will then give you your starting point. You know it's in the hundreds of dollars. You've never seen one that's brought thousands of dollars. So that's how you kind of begin the process. So it then moves on to point number 2 in this valuation for buying, and that is the condition. And this is something every collector is always assessing for themselves as to what is the overall condition of that particular piece. And this condition is, again, a nuanced relative term because your condition sensitivity may be different from somebody else's. Everybody has a different way that they view an antique object. And for some, they like that patina of an antique. They like that it might have a little bit of wear. I know collectors who, they actually prefer Isana Walkers that, as a random doll that I'm picking out, because I remember a collector telling me that I love Isana Walkers that have more wear to them because they've been loved. They have more of an Americana, old feel to it. And then there are others that place a premium on absolutely pristine condition. So it depends on the doll and what we're talking about, but condition is a huge factor, especially when you come into bisque dolls. That is, looking at the bisque and determining, does it have flaws? Does it have hairlines? Does it have restoration? Does it have eye chips? And all of these things are points that collectors are going to assess in this valuation. Then it comes to how pronounced that particular condition, I hate to use the term flaw, but condition factor might be. Is it a hairline that you have to stick a light inside the head and you have to kind of tip your leg backwards and lean a little bit to the left and just grab the natural light coming in through the window while you tilt your head backwards about 4 inches to see it? Well, if that's the case, that's minor for most people. That is not going to affect the aesthetics of the doll. It's not going to really impact value in the same way if it is a really rare doll. Now, if that hairline is pronounced, you can see it when it's sitting in your case, when you're holding it. Is it a chip that is significant off of the eye rim? That's going to have specific fundamental hits on the value of that item without any doubt. Now, there used to be the old adage that, well, a damaged doll is a damaged doll, 50% off. It doesn't work that way. Condition, as I said before, is relative to the particular buyers out there. If it's a doll that is outrageously rare, really unusual, and you find it and it has a hairline that I mentioned you can only see with a light and only ever notice on certain days of the week, then that probably is not going to have a whole lot of basis to the value because it's rare. You may never find one without a hairline in your life. So in that particular case, I say it shouldn't be a factor. But in a lot of other cases, it will be a factor, and that condition has to be something you assess, and if it matters to you as far as how much you're willing to pay for it. So it takes us to number 3, and I guess this really is an extension of condition in a way, and that is originality. Now, it used to not be that way. Back in the day, in the old day, originality was not as critical a factor for a lot of collectors. And we're going back to the 50s, 60s, 70s. Now, yes, there were core groups of very sophisticated early collectors that really sought after originality. I get that. But there were a lot of people that also looked at originality as being a dusty old costume on a doll. They wanted really pristine and crispy new looking costumes. Those days, luckily, are over. People are really into preserving the originality of a doll, and finding one in an original costume is a huge benefit. Now, that can take actually what you might consider a really common doll and bring it into kind of a next level of being not so common, being more rare. I'll give you an example, an SFBJ 301. Now, this is I call them bread and butter dolls that were pretty much mass produced in the early 1900s in France. And sure, they're a French doll. They have sort of a semblance of the look of the earlier, more coveted Jameaux of the 19th century, but they are late. They're more production. They have more of a feel of kind of a German open mouth dolly face doll, as we call it. Now, an SFBJ 301 in a new costume, sort of remade, is what I like to term modern interpretation of an antique doll. You might be looking at $100, $150 as an average price for one of these. So are there exceptions? Absolutely. Find an SFBJ 301. Have it in a completely original costume, perhaps provincial, perhaps something made for Onan Bleu, perhaps something in the bluette genre if it has that proper size. All of these things can absolutely take a common SFBJ 301 bread and butter doll, take it from $100 and suddenly make it worth $1,000 or $1,500. The costume has become a really vital part of the equation of every doll. And that makes sense. When you look at production dolls, the faces, especially like an SFBJ 301, or if you're getting into more contemporary times, an Alexander or a Barbie, which is a production piece that they're ultimately through the ages, yes, there were changes, there were adaptations, there were adjustments made to the looks, but the costume is what really distinguishes the doll. A sissy, as a perfect example from Alexander, is fundamentally the same doll over and over and over again. What drives the value of that sissy is the costume. Is it a common costume that you find very often on a sissy? It's going to bring a lower price. Is it a fabulous mint original costume that has rarely ever been seen? It could shatter records. So costume is something that you really have to assess in a doll, even if it's a 17th century, 18th century English wooden, right up to Barbies of contemporary days. I placed it at number 3, but more and more as fashion becomes an integral part of the collecting experience of dolls, costume really does play into value, can have a massive impact, not only in the pricing, but the demand of that item. The fourth point is provenance. You've heard me talk about for years, and I even wrote a book called Never Ending Stories, that stories are ultimately at the core of what we are selling and what we are collecting. You aren't just collecting an object, you're collecting the story behind that object. And the first thing I try to explain to people about this is, look at a baseball. Now, you're probably thinking, well, wait, we're talking about dolls. Well, let's go to the aside, and the sports memorabilia collectors will enjoy this and probably send me emails complaining. But baseballs ultimately talk about one of the most uniform and similar looking objects you could ever collect. A baseball would be it. But you have baseballs that are bringing millions of dollars. Why? Because there's a story about that baseball. It was the baseball that Barry Bonds hit out of the ballpark for breaking the record in home runs. It was the baseball that Babe Ruth called his shot and hit out of the park. It could be a number of different factors, but all relating to one thing. There's a story of that baseball. What is amazing to me, and I always joke about this, that if a collector bought that baseball and they accidentally dropped it into a basket of other baseballs, which one is it? It's the story that distinguishes the piece. So provenance is really a big factor in pricing as well. What is the story behind that object? When we sold Shirley Temple's personal collection of Hollywood memorabilia, her movie costumes, and her dolls, it was an incredible thing to witness the prices of Shirley Temple dolls that on a normal day from any other collector would go up at auction and maybe bring $500 or $600. Were being fought over and reaching prices sometimes $10,000 to $15,000 for the same piece. There was no difference. It just happened to be Shirley Temple's. It happened to have maybe a photograph of her holding that doll. And that immediately sent values soaring and showing again that the stories are the value. You look at Huguette Clark's collection that we sold a few years ago. She had Jameaus, and this probably relates also to costume as well as provenance, but she had Jameaus that she actually contracted Christian Dior to make doll costumes for. She was such a beloved customer of Christian Dior back in the 1950s. Her collection of Jameaus, she would have them make custom costumes. She would also have Cartier make specific doll jewelry. Now, not only do you have costume on that, what a great story. Who has Christian Dior make doll costumes for them? I think everybody should, but the reality is we can't. Only Huguette Clark did. So it took Jameaus that was in a standard auction, standard costume, no provenance to Huguette Clark or the story to Christian Dior, might bring $4,000. They were bringing $15,000, $20,000 in some cases because of that costume. So provenance, if it has a story, that's going to affect value. That should help you also bring it to another level in your eyes. If that story is unique, if that story resonates with you, if that story is something truly special, you can't even put a value on it. You can't put a price on it. You pay whatever it takes if it means that much to you. Now, the fifth point, this is a bit ethereal in concept, but it's presence. Presence really does factor into the pricing of a doll. You take a EJ Jamo Bebe and you look at that doll and you line up 20 of them in a row, and they're, I want to say, not rare. They're not seen every moment, but they're out there in the market. And you could easily have a collection of 20 of these that you would line up. I promise you, if you put them all in a row, there's going to be one of them that just stands out. There's going to be something about that face. It's going to have just a pop out look to it. Old expression collectors used to use of first out of the mold. The painting was perfect. The sculpting was beautiful. And then it has all of these other ideas that we've talked about earlier, like the costume, or it has a provenance or originality of unique features like Jamo jewelry or signed Jamo shoes. It just pops. That presence, that look of the face, that can have a really big impact on the valuation. And I'll use a Huret as an example, an actual experience of a Huret that we sold a few years ago. Hurets have been very much in demand as of late. One of the really hot markets out there with collectors. It's kind of developed its own level of consciousness in the world of dolls and is something that is lasting and seems to be a whole new niche within our hobby of people who are just really collecting Huret and Huret accessories and fashions. So the market on Hurets has boomed for sure, but it tends to stay at this point. Most of them are bringing, call it 15 to 30,000 range, depending on a lot of different factors, especially is it wearing an original Huret dress? Does it have Huret shoes? But I've seen particular examples soar in price because the face stood out. There was something about it. There was one we sold about 3 years ago that ended up going for about $53,000. Now, at the time, doll collectors were all screaming, well, this is just ridiculous. This is terrible that brought $53,000. Who would pay that kind of a price? Interesting thing was, in the 40s, so I'm talking 40,000, 41, 42, 43, 45,000, you had probably 5 or 6 different people all in that range, well up to the top price. You had 2 to 3 people right up to the end, with one person winning it at around 53,000. So this was not just 2 people in what we sometimes call bidding war, where it was emotional bidding between just 2. This was multiple people that all identified this face as being really, really special. That's presence. That can drive pricing. And it is something to really take into account when you're looking at a piece and be honest with yourself. Does it stand out? Does it pop? How do you know? Experience, time, exposing yourself to a number of different variations of same dolls. Looking at all the Jamo Triste as one example, or sometimes called long-faced Jamos, and comparing them. Looking at different styles and faces and paintings and saying, okay, now I'm kind of identifying which is the one that really stands out. Malcolm Gladwell wrote a book about this called Blink back in, I believe, the 90s. And it was an interesting book for me because he used experts in antiquities and of how they identify quality and actual original pieces versus poorer quality or actual fakes that fool a lot of museums and auction houses and other areas. How do they do it? How do they identify it? They tell you, we can't really explain how we know. We just know. One of the examples of the experts, that I love this quote within the book, was that he used the concept of, it was like I looked at that piece and there was a glass wall in front of it, meaning it was diffused a bit. Something wasn't right. And this is how you, over time, with experience, Learn yourself to value your instincts and your gut and trust it. You will know if you've been doing this for a long time, if you've been collecting for years, if you've been exposed to tens of thousands of dolls during this time, you will know. You will see it. Trust those instincts. That presence will absolutely impact the value of a piece. The sixth is a unique feature. Looking at the doll not just from a whole context, not even just a costume or a face, but looking for very subtle nuances, because one little thing that 9 out of 10 people miss in the examination of a doll, but somebody who really understands those particular models sees, one person sees that there's a unique particular variation of this doll that they have not seen before. And that can be a huge impact on value again. It could be the body style has a slight difference. It could be the eye color is unusual, or the particular size of that model is not one that people have seen before, either very small, which is rare, or perhaps a larger exhibition model, which has only come out twice in history. All of these things can take value into another level for a same model doll that you might even see every other day, as we call it, a bread and butter doll. And it could take it up to, instead of $200 to $2,000 because of that one rare feature. So when you're examining a doll and in the process of valuation, really take a look at every different feature, every inch of it, and look for something that might be different. Finally, number 7, nostalgia. And this is a highly personal factor in valuing a doll for yourself, in that nostalgia is uniquely about you. There's something that that doll has that connects with your heart in a way that is a memory, is a way that triggers positive, euphoric emotions and experience. It could even be something that you didn't have, something as a child that you dreamed of, but you never were able to get. And later on, you collect those dolls, almost as like, we've heard the term revenge travel as of late. This is called revenge collecting. I'm going to buy them all because nobody ever got me one as a child. Nostalgia can absolutely impact value for yourself. And that should be something to take into consideration with all of these other pieces of the puzzle that I've talked about up to this point. So, if you have a direct relationship with a piece, I know people who collect dolls from their youth, and it's something that you really, really love and cherish and want, your valuation of that is probably going to be higher than somebody who is just a standard collector who says, oh, I think I'd like a few examples of that particular doll just to have a cross section. It's not going to have the same valuation for them as it does for you. And so you have to actually take that into account and be honest with yourself. Accept it. You're willing to pay more for that because of the emotions you have in regards to that doll. It makes your heart sing, as Mildred Seeley said. And you pay whatever it takes if that's the case. So that leads us to, in the old adage of, it all depends on whether you're buying or selling, well, to the selling part. And the selling part is a whole sort of another can of worms, let's call it, in how collectors are going to be looking at their items. I mean, let's face it. Everybody always thinks their baby is the most beautiful in the room. And you're right. Your baby is to you. But we now have seen in the buying aspect of how I've just described valuation that other people are going to be looking at factors which relate to them. And it's going to come with different levels of experience. It's going to come with different levels of nostalgia, with different needs a collector is particularly looking for. And you are looking at selling that doll and valuing it in that course. You are doing it in a very personal way that's for you. So I kind of compare this to why very few people, there are some, but very few people are successful in selling their own house. Kind of why you have a real estate agent. The real estate agent is not just there to be a salesperson necessarily. They are also there to take out your personal emotions from the process of valuing the house and understanding what the sale possibility is here. You ultimately, if you want to sell your home, you're the worst person probably to value it. Just as if you want to sell your dolls, you're often the worst person to value those. You're going to always be looking towards the best possible scenario, the highest possible price. And it's going to be very hard for you to bring down sometimes expectations, especially if a market has changed in something you collected. If you were collecting in the 90s and you liked really big dolls in the 35-inch range, well, what you paid then may not be the same now. And are you the best person to decide what the current market is for these? Probably not. So that's why you need someone to kind of help you with the valuations, just like real estate agents are going to help determine for you what is the reality of the marketplace by using comparables, by showing you trends, showing you patterns, and help bring you down into the purpose fold of being able to actually make a sale. Interesting that I've always noticed this phenomena when I tell people the range that their doll is worth in the process or their collection. I'll go and I'll assess a collection and I usually give people a range. Okay, I think your collection is worth probably $100,000 to $140,000. And we'll talk some more and we'll go on, and within about 10 minutes they come back to me and they say, "Okay, well, I appreciate it. So you've valued my collection at $140,000." And I say, "No, I valued your collection at $100,000 to $140,000. This tunnel vision in the selling of your own collection always results in somebody completely forgetting what was the opening estimate and only remembering what was the high estimate, proving my point that sellers are always going to be optimistic, and you should be, to the high end. The cup will be full. The idea of bringing another person into the process of valuing a collection for sale is that it allows for them to kind of bring a little bit more reality into the goal of your actually wanting to sell it. So it's interesting. I'll say this example again, because this is a funny thing that always happens at auctions. I'm notoriously known to be a very slow auctioneer, always trying to look for another bid, kind of give it another few seconds, really make eye contact with people, see if we can pull more for the benefit of the collection that we're selling. And I'm always getting yelled at by collectors after the auction. "You took your time selling that when I was bidding on it. And boy, I can't believe it. Why do you always do that to me?" And I'm like, "Well, I really do it with everyone, but I'll tell you what, when I sell your dolls, I'll sell them really fast." And they're like, "Oh, well, no, I want you to do the same." So this is, I think, really kind of defines the difference between buying and selling and how you value a doll. So ultimately, in the end, for every collector, you got to do you. Don't be distracted by the noise out there of somebody telling you what you should pay or telling you what they would pay, because you are going to look at a piece, you're going to use the 7 points I have just outlined. Probably within a few years, you'll use those points without even thinking of them. They will just naturally roll through as what I call the calculator of a collector. And you'll make your determination that makes you comfortable. And that's all that really matters in the end. As we talked about in investing in dolls, the joy of ownership is the greatest value you will ever derive from collecting. The joy of sharing those pieces with others, talking about them, telling the stories. This is what really matters. You pay what you need to get there and have that and enjoy those pieces and live the happy life of a collector.
Thanks for joining us on this episode of The Curious Collector. The Curious Collector is hosted by Stuart Holbrook and produced by Tammy Trujillo. We invite you to follow us on social media and feel free to leave any questions you have for Stuart on Facebook at Stuart Holbrook-Therialts or follow the Therialt Company Facebook page. And you can stay up to date with the latest auctions and events at Therialts.com. We'll talk to you on the next episode of The Curious Collector.